Most people think empathy is a gift they were born with, something soft, something beautiful, something almost poetic. But what they don't see is the origin of it, the wound that shaped it, the silent moments where a child learned to read emotions, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. You didn't become deeply empathetic because life was easy on you. You became this way because at some point you had to. Because sensing the emotional climate around you was safer than expressing your own storms. Because understanding others became more important than being understood. And here is the truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Feeling others is easy compared to facing yourself. It is easy to sit with someone else's pain and offer compassion because it gives you a sense of purpose, a sense of identity. But when the room is quiet, when there is no one left to rescue, no one left to fix, no one left to understand, what remains is you. And for most people, that is the moment they run. They run into distractions, into relationships, into work, into noise, into anything that keeps them from sitting alone with the one thing they fear the most, their own unresolved pain. But a deeper level of empathy, a rare level, demands something entirely different. It asks you to turn around and face what you have been avoiding. It asks you to sit in the discomfort you once escaped. It asks you to stop using others as a mirror to understand yourself and instead look directly within. Because the truth is, if your empathy is only directed outward, it is incomplete. It becomes a mask. It becomes a role you play. It becomes a way to stay disconnected from your own truth while appearing deeply connected to others. And that kind of empathy will always exhaust you. You will give and give and give and still feel empty. You will understand everyone and still feel unseen. You will be there for everyone and still feel alone. Not because you are broken, but because you have learned to abandon yourself in the process of being available to others. Facing your own pain is not a gentle process. It is not comfortable. It is not something you can romanticize. It requires you to revisit the moments you tried to forget. It requires you to feel emotions you once suppressed just to survive. It requires you to acknowledge truths about your past that may challenge the story you have been telling yourself. And most people will not go there. Not because they are incapable, but because it feels safer to stay distracted than to be confronted. But here is what changes everything. The moment you stop running, the moment you decide to sit with your pain instead of escaping it, something begins to shift. You start to see that your sensitivity was never the problem. Your pain was never the enemy. Your emotional depth was never something to fix. It was something that needed your attention. And for the first time, your empathy turns inward. You begin to listen to yourself the way you have always listened to others. You begin to hold your own experiences with the same compassion you so freely give away. You begin to understand that your reactions, your fears, your patterns, they all have roots. They all make sense when you look closely enough. This is where real transformation begins. Not in understanding others, but in understanding yourself. Because when you face your own pain, you stop projecting it. You stop unconsciously expecting others to heal what you haven't healed. You stop confusing connection with dependency. You stop mistaking overgiving for love. And something else happens, something subtle but powerful. Your empathy becomes clearer. It is no longer driven by fear. It is no longer driven by the need to be accepted or needed. It is no longer entangled with your own unresolved wounds. It becomes grounded, it becomes honest, it becomes real. You can sit with someone's pain without losing yourself in it. You can care without carrying what is not yours. You can understand without absorbing everything, because you have finally learned to differentiate between your emotions and theirs. And that clarity only comes from doing the inner work most people avoid. This is why it is rare, because it requires courage that cannot be faked. It requires honesty that cannot be bypassed. It requires a willingness to feel what you once refused to feel. It requires you to stop performing empathy and start living in truth. And truth is uncomfortable. Truth will show you where you have been pretending. It will show you where you have been overextending yourself to avoid looking within. It will show you where your kindness was rooted in fear of rejection. It will show you where your understanding of others was actually a way to avoid understanding yourself. But if you stay with it, if you resist the urge to run, you begin to reclaim something you didn't even realize you had lost. Yourself. Not the version of you that adapts to others. Not the version of you that is always available. Not the version of you that exists to make others comfortable. But the real you. The one beneath the patterns. The one beneath the conditioning. The one that has been waiting for your attention all along. And from that place, your empathy changes completely. It is no longer about losing yourself in others. It is about meeting them from a place of wholeness. It is no longer about fixing or rescuing. It is about witnessing and understanding without self-abandonment. And that is something most people never reach, not because it is impossible, but because it asks too much of them. It asks them to give up the comfort of avoidance. It asks them to face the parts of themselves they have spent years trying to silence. But for those who choose to go there, for those who are willing to sit in the discomfort and not turn away, empathy becomes something entirely different. It becomes wisdom. Most people believe they know themselves, but what they actually know is a carefully constructed version of who they had to become in order to be accepted, to be safe, to belong. They know their roles, their habits, their reactions, but they do not know the deeper forces driving them, the unconscious patterns shaping their choices, the hidden fears influencing their behavior. Radical self-awareness begins the moment you stop mistaking your patterns for your identity. It is the moment you recognize that the way you react is not random, that your emotional triggers are not accidents, that your repeated struggles are not just bad luck. They are signals. They are reflections of something within you that has not yet been seen, understood, or integrated. And here is where most people turn away, because true awareness is not flattering. It will show you the parts of yourself you have been avoiding. It will expose the moments where you were not as kind as you believe, not as honest as you claim, not as selfless as you present yourself to be. It will reveal how often your actions were driven by fear rather than love, by insecurity rather than strength, by the need for approval rather than authenticity. And that realization can feel uncomfortable, even confronting, because it disrupts the image you have built of yourself. But without that disruption, there is no growth, because you cannot change what you refuse to see. Most people want transformation without awareness. They want to feel better without understanding why they feel the way they do. They want healthier relationships without examining the patterns they bring into them. They want peace without confronting the chaos they carry inside. But it doesn't work that way. Awareness is the foundation. Without it, everything else is temporary. And awareness alone is not enough. It must be followed by responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility that blames or shames, but the kind that empowers. The kind that says, "This is mine to understand. This is mine to work through. This is mine to change." Because as long as your focus is on what others have done to you, you remain stuck. You may be right about what happened. You may have been hurt, misunderstood, overlooked, or even deeply wounded. And those experiences matter. They shape you. They leave an imprint. But if you stay only in that narrative, you give your power away. Responsibility does not mean denying what others have done. It means refusing to let it define who you become. It means recognizing that while you may not have chosen your experiences, you are still responsible for how you respond to them, how you interpret them, and how you carry them forward. And that is where true strength begins. Because it is much easier to point outward than to look inward. It is much easier to say, "This is because of them," than to ask, "What is happening within me?" It is much easier to stay in familiar patterns than to challenge them. But growth demands discomfort. It demands that you question your assumptions, that you examine your reactions, that you become curious about your own mind instead of being controlled by it. Why do certain words affect you so deeply? Why do certain situations trigger such strong emotional responses? Why do you find yourself repeating the same relational patterns, even when they hurt you? These are not questions most people ask, because they require honesty. And honesty at that level can feel exposing. But without those questions, nothing changes. Radical self-awareness is not about judging yourself. It is about understanding yourself. It is about creating enough space between you and your reactions that you can observe them instead of being consumed by them. It is the ability to notice your anger without immediately acting on it, to recognize your fear without letting it dictate your choices, to see your insecurities without allowing them to define your worth. And that kind of awareness takes practice. It takes patience. It takes a willingness to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. Because the moment you become aware of something, you also become responsible for it. You can no longer say, "I didn't know." You can no longer pretend it isn't there. You can no longer avoid the work without being conscious of that avoidance. And that is where many people hesitate because awareness removes the comfort of ignorance. But it also opens the door to freedom. Because when you are aware, you have a choice. You can choose to respond differently. You can choose to interrupt old patterns. You can choose to act from intention rather than impulse. And over time, those choices reshape your life. They change the way you relate to others. They change the way you relate to yourself. They change the kind of experiences you create and the kind of people you attract. Because you are no longer operating on autopilot. You are present, you are conscious, you are engaged in your own growth. And that changes everything. It means you no longer need to control others to feel safe, because you understand your own triggers. It means you no longer need constant validation, because you have developed a deeper sense of self. It means you no longer lose yourself in relationships, because you are anchored within. And this is why it is rare, because it requires a level of honesty that most people are not willing to embrace. It requires you to let go of the stories that keep you comfortable, but stuck. It requires you to confront the parts of yourself that are still operating from fear, even when you want to believe you have moved beyond it. It requires you to grow up emotionally in a way that cannot be forced, only chosen. And that choice must be made again and again. Every time you are faced with a situation that challenges you, every time an old pattern resurfaces, every time you are given the opportunity to react unconsciously or respond with awareness. There is no final destination where you become perfectly self-aware and never struggle again. There is only a continuous process of noticing, learning, adjusting, and growing. And in that process, something begins to shift. You become less reactive and more reflective. You become less defensive and more open. You become less driven by fear and more guided by understanding. You begin to see yourself clearly, not as you wish you were, not as others expect you to be, but as you are in this moment. And from that clarity, real change becomes possible. Not the kind of change that is forced or superficial, but the kind that is rooted in understanding, sustained by awareness, and guided by responsibility. The kind that transforms not just your behavior, but the way you experience yourself and the world around you. From the very beginning, most people are taught, directly or indirectly, that their worth lives outside of them, in approval, in praise, in being accepted, in not being rejected. And so, without even realizing it, they begin to build themselves around the reactions of others. They learn what to say, how to act, who to be, not based on truth, but based on what will keep them included. You don't start your life needing validation. You learn to need it. You learn it in the subtle moments when love feels conditional, when attention is given for certain behaviors and withdrawn for others, when being good is rewarded and being authentic is quietly discouraged. You learn that belonging comes at a cost, and that cost is often yourself. So you adapt. You become what is acceptable. You become what is liked. You become what is safe. And the more you do that, the further you move away from who you actually are. But here's the part that most people don't question. The system works, at least on the surface. You get approval. You get recognition. You get validation. And for a moment, it feels like enough. It feels like you are seen. It feels like you matter. But that feeling never lasts. Because anything that comes from the outside can be taken away from the outside. And so you find yourself chasing it again. Another approval, another confirmation, another moment where someone reflects back to you that you are enough. This is how dependency is formed, not on people, but on their perception of you. And the cost of that dependency is your freedom, because the moment your worth is tied to how others see you, you no longer belong to yourself. Your decisions become filtered through the question, will this be accepted? Your truth becomes edited to fit expectations. Your voice becomes quieter, more controlled, more careful. You begin to perform instead of live, and the performance is exhausting. It requires constant monitoring, constant adjusting, constant awareness of how you are being perceived. You cannot relax into yourself because you are always trying to maintain an image. You cannot fully express yourself because you are always calculating the response. And deep down, there is a quiet tension, the sense that even when you are accepted, it is not truly you that is being accepted, but the version you have learned to present. This is why validation never satisfies for long, because it is not reaching the real you. Breaking free from this is not a surface-level shift. It is not about pretending you no longer care what people think. It is about understanding why you cared so much in the first place. It is about seeing how your need for validation was shaped, how it was reinforced, how it became a strategy for safety rather than a reflection of your worth. And once you see that clearly, something begins to loosen. You start to realize that the approval you have been chasing was never meant to define you. It was a response, not a truth. It was a reflection of others' perceptions, not a measure of your value. And that realization creates space. Space to question, space to pause, space to choose differently. Because now, instead of automatically seeking validation, you can ask yourself a different question. Is this true to me? And that question changes everything. It shifts your focus from external approval to internal alignment. It moves you from performing for others to being honest with yourself. It allows you to act from authenticity rather than fear. But this shift is not comfortable, because the moment you stop seeking validation, you also risk losing it. You risk being misunderstood, you risk being judged, you risk being rejected. And those fears are not imaginary, they are real, because when you stop conforming, not everyone will understand you, not everyone will agree with you, not everyone will accept you. But here is what becomes clear over time. The acceptance you lose was never rooted in your truth to begin with. It was conditional. It was dependent on your performance. It was tied to a version of you that was shaped to fit expectations. And when that version begins to dissolve, so does the approval attached to it. At first, that can feel unsettling. It can feel like loss. It can feel like you are stepping into uncertainty without the familiar reassurance you once relied on. But something else begins to emerge in its place, a deeper sense of self, not one that is dependent on how you are perceived, but one that is grounded in how you understand yourself. Not one that fluctuates with others' opinions, but one that remains steady regardless of them. You begin to feel less pulled by the need to be liked and more anchored in the need to be real. You begin to value honesty over approval, alignment over acceptance, truth over comfort. And in that shift, something powerful happens. You start to experience a different kind of freedom. The freedom to speak without constantly filtering yourself. The freedom to make decisions without needing external confirmation. The freedom to be misunderstood without losing your sense of self. And that freedom is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and deeply grounding. It shows up in small moments, when you say what you truly think instead of what is expected, when you choose what feels right instead of what looks good, when you allow yourself to be seen as you are rather than as you should be. These moments build. They strengthen your trust in yourself. They reinforce your sense of identity. They remind you that your worth does not need to be proven or approved. And over time, the need for validation begins to fade, not because you have forced it away, but because it is no longer necessary. You no longer look outward to define yourself because you have developed an internal reference point. You no longer depend on others to confirm your value because you have come to understand it from within. This does not mean you become indifferent to others. It means your relationship to their opinions changes. You can listen without being controlled. You can receive feedback without being defined by it. You can appreciate recognition without needing it to feel whole. And that is what makes this level of growth so rare, because it requires you to let go of something that once felt essential to your sense of self. It requires you to step out of a system that most people are still operating within. It requires you to face the discomfort of standing in your truth without the guarantee of acceptance. But in doing so, you reclaim something far more valuable than approval. You reclaim your autonomy. You reclaim your voice. You reclaim your ability to live in alignment with who you are, rather than who you have been conditioned to be. And from that place, your presence changes. Your energy changes. Your relationships change. Because you are no longer seeking to be validated, you are simply being yourself. Most people confuse compassion with self-sacrifice, as if caring deeply for others requires you to slowly disappear in the process. They have been taught, sometimes subtly and sometimes directly, that being a good person means saying yes when they want to say no, giving when they are already empty, staying when every part of them is asking to leave. And so they begin to measure their worth by how much they can endure, how much they can tolerate, how much of themselves they can give away without asking for anything in return. At first, it feels like love. It feels like kindness. It feels like purpose. But over time, something begins to fracture beneath the surface, because every time you override your own needs to meet someone else's, you send yourself a quiet message that your boundaries do not matter. Every time you silence your truth to keep the peace, you teach yourself that your voice is negotiable. Every time you remain in situations that drain you in the name of compassion, you slowly disconnect from your own sense of self. And the tragedy is you call this empathy. But empathy without boundaries is not compassion. It is self-abandonment disguised as virtue. Real compassion does not require you to lose yourself. It requires you to remain present with both the other person and yourself at the same time. It asks you to feel without absorbing, to care without caring, to understand without surrendering your own needs. And that distinction is where everything changes. Because when you begin to understand this, you start to see how much of your giving was not coming from wholeness, but from fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being seen as selfish, fear of losing connection, fear of not being enough unless you were constantly proving your worth through what you gave. And so you gave more. You gave your time when you were exhausted. You gave your energy when you were depleted. You gave your presence when you needed space. You gave your understanding even when your own pain was being ignored, not because you were weak, but because you had learned that love had to be earned. But here is what becomes undeniable when you begin to look honestly. The more you gave without boundaries, the less you were respected. The more you tolerated, the more it was expected. The more you abandoned yourself, the more disconnected you became, not just from others, but from your own truth. Because people do not learn how to treat you from what you say, they learn from what you allow. And when there are no boundaries, there is no clarity. When there is no clarity, there is no balance. And when there is no balance, what you call compassion begins to turn into resentment. That quiet frustration you feel, that exhaustion you cannot explain, that sense of being unappreciated or unseen, it does not come from caring too much. It comes from caring without limits. And eventually, something inside you begins to push back. It may not be loud at first. It may show up as discomfort, as irritation, as a subtle resistance to giving more. But if you ignore it, if you continue to override it, it grows stronger. It turns into burnout. It turns into emotional fatigue. It turns into a deep sense of disconnection that no amount of giving can fix. Because you cannot pour from a place that has been emptied by neglecting yourself. This is where the shift begins, not in withdrawing your compassion, but in redefining it. You begin to realize that saying no is not a failure of empathy. It is an expression of self-respect. You begin to understand that creating distance is not rejection, but protection. You begin to see that boundaries are not walls that shut people out, but structures that allow healthy connection to exist. And this realization can feel uncomfortable because it challenges everything you have been conditioned to believe about what it means to care. You may feel guilt when you start to set limits. You may feel resistance when you stop overextending yourself. You may question whether you are becoming less kind, less generous, less understanding. But what is actually happening is that you are becoming more honest. You are no longer giving from obligation, but from choice. You're no longer responding from fear, but from clarity. You're no longer trying to prove your worth through sacrifice, but expressing it through alignment. And that changes the quality of everything you offer. Because when your compassion is grounded in boundaries, it is no longer draining. It becomes sustainable. It becomes real. It becomes something that supports both you and the other person, rather than depleting one to serve the other. You begin to notice that you can still care deeply without saying yes to everything. You can still be present without being available at all times. You can still support others without taking responsibility for their lives. You start to understand that you are not here to fix everyone, to rescue everyone, to carry everyone. You are here to relate, to connect, to understand, but not at the cost of yourself. And this understanding shifts your relationships in profound ways. Some people may not like your boundaries. They may resist them. They may question them. They may even walk away when you stop giving in the way they have become accustomed to. And that can feel painful. But it also reveals something important. Not everyone was connected to you for who you are. Some were connected to what you provided, to how much you gave, to how much of yourself you were willing to sacrifice. And when that dynamic changes, the relationship must either evolve or fall away. What remains are connections that can meet you at a place of mutual respect, where giving is not one-sided, where understanding flows both ways, where your presence is valued without requiring your depletion. And in those connections, your compassion feels different. It feels lighter. It feels grounded. It feels free from the weight of expectation, because it is no longer driven by the need to be needed. It is driven by a genuine desire to connect, to support, to understand, without losing yourself in the process. This is what makes it rare, because it requires you to unlearn patterns that have been reinforced for years. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of change, the uncertainty of new dynamics, the challenge of standing in your truth when it would be easier to return to what is familiar. It requires you to trust that you are allowed to exist as more than what you give, and that trust does not come instantly. It is built through each moment where you choose to honor yourself, even when it feels difficult, even when it feels unfamiliar, even when it challenges the version of you that others have come to expect. Over time, those choices reshape your sense of self. They reinforce the understanding that your needs matter, that your energy is valuable, that your presence does not have to be earned through sacrifice. And from that place, your compassion becomes something entirely different. Not a means of losing yourself, but a reflection of a self that is finally whole enough to remain intact while still caring deeply for others.